Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A session with Wild Animal Initiative. We're going to get the presentation started and people will continue to trickle in. My name is Hollis. I'm going to be facilitating today. I'm joined by Luke Hecht, who leads our grants program, Victoria Elliott, who's our science director, and Simon Liedholm, who's our postdoctoral research fellow. Luke is going to give a brief presentation about our grants program and the current call for proposals, and then we're going to open up for questions. We're going to be accepting questions through the Q&A window. That's different than the chat box. So if everyone would just familiarize yourself with the lower part of your screen, you should see an option for Q&A. If you click on that, it'll open up a window. Anyone can submit a question at any point during the webinar. Answered questions will be archived in the second tab. And you can also vote and comment on other people's questions if you see one very similar to your own that you want to add on to. We're going to be prioritizing questions based on votes. We will try to get to all the questions today, but as a reminder, if there's anything that you want to ask later, you can always contact us at grants@wildanimalalinitiative.org. We're happy to answer any questions. So now I'm going to hand it over to Luke to give a presentation. Luke, whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Luke, and I'm a sort of grants program coordinator at Wild Animal Initiative. I'm just going to share my screen now. Cool. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yep, looks good, Luke.
Great. Okay. So we can all appreciate the beauty of the natural world, and many wild animals are lucky enough to live good lives in the wild. However, we also have to acknowledge that the vast majority of animals face serious challenges, many caused by humans, but most not, such as disease, hunger, natural disasters, and predation. It isn't clear what we can or should do about many of these issues as humans. But at Wild Animal Initiative, we do believe that humans have a responsibility to figure this out and help however we can. So this webinar is to introduce you to our small grants program. And the purpose of this program is ultimately to understand and improve the welfare of wild animals, as well as to increase the number and diversity of researchers in the field of wild animal welfare. With this small grants program specifically, we are looking to make grants in the range of about $2,000 to $30,000 US. And this is suitable for small projects or extensions of existing projects that are focused on welfare, such as like adding additional welfare metrics to be measured as part of your existing ecology project. We especially encourage applicants from who are early in their career and applications from researchers belonging to underrepresented communities, such as people of color, women, etc. So just to go over a couple definitions, basically, from our point of view. When we talk about wild animals, we are thinking about any individual animal whose life is not closely managed by humans. So this isn't defined by species, but rather the experience of the individual animal. So animals living freely in human-dominated urban environments would be wild animals, but a giraffe in a zoo or a monkey in a laboratory wouldn't be considered a wild animal. However, we would still consider projects studying those animals if you could explain how the results would inform our ability to improve the welfare of wild individuals of the same species or different species. When we talk about welfare, we're talking about the quality of an animal's life from that animal's point of view. So that's a subjective mental property. In sort of behavioral science, it's often addressed as affective state or well-being, especially with humans. And although it is a subjective mental property, it's of course influenced by physical factors like nutrition, environment, health, and the ability of individual animals to express behaviors that they want to express. So for our grants program, we have these main selection criteria. We most importantly are looking at the impact of a project. And that is not only the immediate impact, but also long-term impact. So how many animals will it affect, and by how much, essentially, either directly through the project or by informing later work. We're also interested in engagement, so whether the project will accelerate or inspire other research that would support wild animal welfare. And we're interested in projects that have broad applicability that would benefit potentially many individuals, either because they're transferable across species or because the project is focused on a highly numerous species, like urban pigeons, for example. We also want to make sure that projects are tractable, meaning that they have a high probability of being able to be carried out as described. And one of the more unusual selection criteria is neglectedness. So we want, like, given basically limited resources to fund projects in wild animal welfare compared to some other fields like conservation, we especially want to identify projects that would be unlikely to receive funding from other sources. So projects that are not of strong intrinsic scientific interest or great applicability to conservation, but ones that are especially valuable to welfare. We're also, of course, concerned about research ethics, so we want to make sure that projects won't cause any unnecessary harm to non-human animals or people, and that will be part of the full proposal process, as we'll discuss in a bit. So basic eligibility for the small grants program will require projects shedding light on at least one of the following questions. What are the subjective experiences of wild animals like? Or what strategies we can use to improve the welfare of wild animals responsibly? And those questions should also be answered in the context of at least one of the following themes, which is specific to this round of our grants program. So the first theme is innovative methods for measuring wild animals' welfare. So the incredible diversity of wild animals and their experiences makes assessment of their welfare especially challenging compared to in captive contexts. So we're looking for projects that seek to develop and validate new welfare indicators based on behavioral or physiological measurements. In terms of validation, one of the main things we want to see is agreement between indicators from physiological and behavioral domains. We also support the development of non-invasive methods for measuring welfare that could replace more invasive ones. However, note that we get a lot of interest in this issue, so we especially prioritize work being done on highly numerous taxa whose welfare is often ignored, such as fish and invertebrates. Finally, we're especially interested in development of ways to measure positive welfare in wild animals, such as experiences of comfort, pleasure, safety, or enjoyment. It's often easier to tell when an animal is distressed than when they're happy, but we ultimately want to work towards a world where all animals are happy, and to do that, we need to be able to measure it. Another challenge in studying wild animals' welfare is the limited capability for monitoring them. Clearly, there's substantial overlap with monitoring and measuring. But one distinguishing factor is that we're open to supporting powerful new ways of monitoring things like activity budgets and survival that are clearly related to welfare, but whose relationship to welfare is not yet understood well enough to consider them as true welfare indicators. So an example of this might be using an array of microphones to gain a snapshot of the welfare state of numerous individual birds as they pass through a patch of forest. So the welfare of a population, from our point of view, is essentially the sum of the welfare of its constituent individuals. So processes regulating the size of animal populations, such as resource availability, disease, predation, and disturbance, must also impact the day-to-day welfare experienced by individuals. So to understand this better, we're looking for projects that seek to relate population level dynamics and metrics, such as population density or disturbance in a local ecosystem, to individual welfare. We also want to understand the trade-offs that individuals make when faced with resource scarcity and how these affect their welfare and that of their offspring. We also want to understand how conflicts of interest among animals, such as resource competition and predator-prey dynamics, influence the welfare of the animals involved. And this includes understanding impacts of single species population management on the sort of aggregate welfare of multi-species communities. So if we, for example, gave contraception to urban pigeons, how might that affect the welfare of other animals that compete with urban pigeons for the same resources? So on the theme of rehabilitation and conservation, these interventions, or at least some interventions within these areas, aim to help wild animals survive and thrive through challenging periods. And they have the potential for long-term impact on the welfare of the animals who benefit from those interventions. But we're looking for projects that seek to quantify the welfare impact of wildlife rehabilitation or similar conservation interventions, such as head starting, in terms of their effects on survival and welfare indicators later in the life of those individuals. We also want to understand risk factors that could be used to predict which individuals are at greatest risk of poor welfare and what could be done proactively to help them or to mitigate those same risks for other individuals. So in applying for our small grants program, the first stage is to submit an expression of interest form. For this, we're asking for a brief summary of your project, focusing on background and objectives. We basically want to get a rough idea of what you'll be working on and who you'll be working with and what role you'll play in the project. But definitely note that you don't need to convince us at this point that this is the perfect project. This is more of a screening so that we can judge the concept of the project to determine that it's highly relevant to wild animal welfare and that it will be competitive, essentially so that we don't waste your time filling out a much more extensive proposal. So after the expression of interest stage, we will be inviting select applicants to submit full proposals. And at this stage, we'll be asking for a succinct literature review to explain the context of the project, an outline of the objectives and hypotheses in as much detail as possible, a detailed description of the methods, an explanation of how the results would contribute to understanding and improving wild animals' welfare, and also a detailed budget and rough timeline. And in that budget, we would like to see it broken down as much as possible. So itemized. So the budget should be itemized in terms of what specific things the money is going towards. But also it will help us evaluate the project if you could identify what activities different budget items are associated with and what activities are contingent on funding for specific budget items in case we want to offer you partial funding. So expression of interest forms are due at the end of June. And then in July, we will be inviting applicants to submit full proposals. Following that, for a few months, we will be meeting with everybody to advise as they develop their full proposal. This should be mutually beneficial because we obviously want to get a project at the end that is as valuable as possible for wild animal welfare as we think of it. And also we can help you to craft as competitive as possible a proposal as well. So full proposals will then be due at the end of September of this year. And following that, the proposals will be reviewed by peer experts, as well as our internal research team and an animal ethics committee. So I forgot to mention that as part of the full proposal, we'll also be asking you to fill out an animal impacts form that will basically go into more detail about what is being done to animals as part of the study. Like if you're drawing blood or doing any sort of experiments, we want to know how many individuals are affected, what alternatives there might be to impact fewer animals or cause less harm, and ultimately what justifications you'd have for doing that work. And then finally, we aim to deliver decisions on the grants by the end of January of 2023. So that's the end of my presentation here, and pass back over to Hollis for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luke. As a note, so in the Q&A window, you can also see that Simon has been answering some questions over text. Feel free to follow up with another question if that doesn't completely answer what you had in mind. Let's start with a question from Chelsea Greer. So Chelsea asks, they're conducting 2 complementary research projects that are both testing non-invasive methods of surveying wolves. One is in a town where garbage management is an issue and wolves are being killed because of their close proximity to the dump and to people. The second research project is in an area where intensive logging is occurring, destroying habitat for wolves and many other species. Do these research projects fall within the goals of Wild Animal Initiative if it is advancing new techniques to monitor a species that is often collared, plus the data will be used to inform coexistence strategies?
Yeah, I think that would definitely fall within the scope here. Yeah, because it's focusing on human wildlife conflict, that's something that we're definitely interested in. We would basically consider whether it could receive funding from other interests, like public health and safety or conservation. But it's definitely something that we would consider, and it sounds like an interesting project.
Thanks. I also want to highlight a question that Simon answered earlier, but I think will be shared by many applicants. Are animals bred in captivity to be released into the wild to enhance local wildlife populations considered wild animals by Wild Animal Initiative?
Yeah, we would consider those wild animals. But I suppose we would be mainly focused on what we could learn about other wild animals through studying them, rather than focusing on their success in terms of like restoring a local population for conservation purposes.
Great, thank you. Ooh, this is a good one from Jessica Rendell. Would you consider reviewing projects where the species is a non-native or feral species?
Oh, yeah, we would definitely consider projects dealing with non-native or feral animals. Yeah, sort of urban wildlife, especially, is yeah, an area that we're quite interested in. I think just one thing to clarify is in terms of our definition of wild animals and its relationship to the concept of them being feral. Uh, we we would consider feral horses, for example, to be wild animals if their lives aren't being managed by humans, like if they're not receiving a sort of veterinary care and sort of determining what patch of land they go to any given moment, like livestock.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, the way that Wild Animal Initiative approaches definitions of wild versus domestic animals or feral animals is a little bit different than I think some funding organizations. So that's a really important clarification to make. So Morteza asks, I'm also working on brown bears in Turkey. There's a project on live trapping and we take blood samples as well. There's an open garbage dump and bears are feeding there. Hibernation may not happen in some areas because of their access to food through the winter. Morteza is also a PI of a project on brown bear landscape genomics. They're collecting scat to test stress hormones. Should they propose 2 or 3 ideas instead of 1?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, anyone can feel free to submit multiple expressions of interest, and we can basically work out which one, if any, we want to proceed with, basically. Yeah, those all sound potentially interesting.
And does Wild Animal Initiative prioritize projects that study animals in the wild versus animals in zoos or rehabilitation centers?
Yes, in the sense that we're concerned with improving the lives of animals in the wild. We wouldn't inherently prioritize how that knowledge is gained. So like if it seemed like the most effective way to learn about to learn about the welfare of animals in the wild, or to develop a method for improving their lives in the wild, if the most effective next step involved studying it or trialing it on captive animals, that's something that we would definitely consider. It's just that the ultimate impact of the project should be focused on its transference to wild animals.
Great, thank you, Luke. Victoria is actually going to take the next question. Victoria, Patrick asks, will this round fund pilot projects that would really only be a proof of concept in order to try and then get a larger grant later on? They know that we said it could be a project complementing current work, just wondering if it could be the other way around as well.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to share this in the live chat, in the live response, because I think it's a question that other people might have also. So we, as you say, we're considering add-ons to existing projects that would allow people to include a welfare component to an existing portfolio or to an existing grant. And we're also considering sort of smaller standalone projects, like say a field study that would fit within the budget available to collect data on metrics, for example, or the measurement values that would be sort of within that smaller budget, but provide specifically welfare relevant indicators or information. And then, yes, the proof of concept, if you had like a bigger idea and you wanted to test it out and see if it would work, like looking at behavioral associations with physiological indicators. You could pilot that to prove the concept, and then potentially in the future, either to another grantee, another donor, or to a future call that we might have, if it was applicable, to look to then expand the scope of it to having shown proof of concept of something.
Great. Thank you so much. Looks like that answered Patrick's question. We did have one question about accelerating the decision timeline. Victoria answered that in the chat. Victoria, would you want to reiterate the circumstances under which we would consider a faster timeline?
I'm happy to do that. So we can consider a faster timeline than January. If there is a certain amount of urgency, the project would have to first be submitted to the EOI stage. And so we wouldn't make any decisions about projects before the expressions of interest have all been received and evaluated, but we might be able to then expedite the proposal review component if it was something that was very time sensitive, and assuming that that project was past the EOI stage, was invited for full proposal. One comment that, so this was, the question was related specifically to a highly endangered species. And although we definitely do welcome projects proposing studies on welfare related to conservation species, if the scope for the species is so low that it's very much more a conservation concern than it is a welfare concern, then we probably would find that it doesn't meet our criteria for scope, i.e. the number of animals that the project would affect, and or it might not meet our neglectedness criteria, as in it's likely that other conservation funders would pick that up and fund it. So there's another question that's also related to conservation or endangered species. So for example, if a study is looking at identifying specific indicators that could be used for an endangered species, but that would be highly transferable to a more numerous species, that sort of project would definitely be considered and meet most of the criteria. If it's something that would be very specifically targeted at a critically endangered species and there would be no transferability to other species, it's unlikely that it would meet our funding criteria. But we will be looking at them on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, thanks. You actually, yeah, for getting two questions in one there. In case you missed it, anonymous attendee who asked about large-bodied critically endangered animals. The best way to frame such a study for funding from our organization would be to demonstrate the applicability of the welfare indicators that you're studying to more numerous animals of other species. Couple of logistical questions. Luke, can we offer funding to individual researchers or nonprofits, or are we only offering funding to people who are members of universities or institutions, other institutions?
Yes, we can definitely fund individuals and nonprofits. During the expression, or on the expression of interest form, there will be a place to identify how you're applying, though we'll get back to that later in the process if you reach that stage when we're actually considering making the award.
And can more than one practitioner or project from the same institution submit expressions of interest, or should they limit it to one?
Yes, yeah, more than one person from the same institution can submit. I think we wouldn't accept more than one project ultimately from a single principal investigator, though you can submit as many expressions of interest as you want, and we would then identify the most compelling one. But on the scale of an institution, multiple PIs could submit different projects from the same university or organization.
Great, thank you. Another question. This person has a collaborator who may also be interested in this call for proposals. Their projects are related, but they're separate studies. They focus on one species and she focuses on interactions between that species and another. Do we have any idea of how many proposals will be funded in this round and whether two similar or complementary studies might be considered in the same funding round? They don't want to be in direct competition with their colleague.
Yeah, so that is a difficult question. I guess it depends on how significant the overlap is. So yeah, you might consider submitting together as collaborators on the same project, but if that's not possible, I'd suggest emailing us directly at grants@wildanimalinitiative.org, and we can discuss that in terms of your more specific situation.
And do we have an idea how many proposals will be funding this round?
I don't think we don't have a set target.
Reminder, what was the amount of money that we're planning to award per proposal?
Yeah, per proposal, we're considering a range of $2,000 to $30,000, but we will. It basically depends on how many projects are compelling enough for us to fund. We don't have a set maximum. Obviously, we do have a maximum amount of funding, but we haven't yet discussed like what limit to set on the number of projects.
Great. And I have a question from Maddie. Basically, where should they submit their application form?
Well, most likely you found this webinar through the Wild Animal Initiative website. If you go to wildanimalinitiative.org and go to the grants section of the page, there will be a link to the page for this call for proposals. And from there will be a link to submit an expression of interest form. So that's where you'll want to submit it. And then later in the process, you may or may not be invited to submit a full proposal, if that's specifically what you mean. But that will be submitted, or you'll receive a link at that time to a new form to submit your full proposal.
Thanks. Yeah, I dropped the link to the call for proposal page in the chat. That's where you can find the expression of interest form, our contact information, the PDF with the full call for proposals in it and all our selection criteria. That is also where we will be posting the recording of this webinar after like probably a couple hours from now. It'll be live. In regards to our like scale criterion, are there specific population sizes that WISE is interested in? For example, would the scope need to encompass thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of individuals in order to meet our relevance criterion there?
Yeah, we don't have a hard rule. And again, it also depends on how transferable to other species it is. But I would say that thousands or tens of thousands is what you should be aiming for. Or, I mean, the more the better, but probably at least 1,000.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. But yeah, it's like if you're considering a population of thousands of individuals, that definitely passes the bar for consideration. You should fill out an expression of interest. Hi, Simon, please feel free to chime in, add what you want to say.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to also add to that the previous question you were talking about, that if there's reason to believe that you could transfer knowledge across species easily, then it might be like you might consider this number of individuals to be effectively a lot larger, even if you're studying like an endangered species. If you think that there's lots that you can learn about some related, very numerous species, then that's very interesting. So
yeah, also important how you're defining the population, I guess, for the scope. So yeah, like Simon was saying, you might be studying, for your study, you might actually be looking at a population of salmon in a specific river, but that's clearly generalizable to salmon in other rivers potentially, and other related species of fish potentially. And so that's what we would want to consider for determining the scope.
Victoria, would you care to answer Morteza's second question?
So Morteza asked whether it would be possible to share some example proposals of things that have already been funded. So we wouldn't be able in any situation to share directly somebody's proposal, but we do have some example ideas that we published as part of our first call for proposals that we could share, and they're still available on our website. We also have the details of projects that we have funded during our first round, but just to advise that those were part of our larger grant proposals, and so some of the scope that is not in terms of our criteria, but in terms of the details of the project might be a bit more expansive than what we would be expecting at this stage. But those two should help give you an idea of what we're looking for. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Victoria. And would you also let us know, are there any geographic limitations to where we're accepting proposals from?
Yeah, no, there are no geographic restrictions, with the exception that if it is because Y is based in the United States, then we are bound by their the US requirements for not funding work that is in any territory that is not accepted by the United States. So for example, work in Myanmar, for example, would not be feasible under the study because it's not, funding is not allowed to go there from the United States.
In terms of the project being attractive to other funders, if it may be funded by other animal welfare funders, does that decrease their chances in our proposal process? Just wondering, in case the project budget is over $30,000 US. So I think part of this question is, would we consider partially funding a project that is that they are looking for funding elsewhere from?
Yeah, we certainly consider partial funding or sort of co-funding if you're looking for funding from elsewhere.
But so the first part of that question, though, about whether or not they are likely to get funding from, say, traditional conservation organizations, does that affect our decision process, Luke?
Yeah, that relates to our neglectedness criterion, where it very very well may be a compelling project and totally valuable for wild animal welfare. But because there are also many similarly compelling projects in terms of wild animal welfare that do not have conservation relevance or any other sort of relevance, we try to focus our funding towards them wherever possible. So I would still submit the project. It's definitely eligible. It's just bear in mind that we will consider that, whether it would likely be funded by another, in terms of another cause, essentially, when your project is in competition against others.
And Luke, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like in some cases, the welfare specific aspect of a project might not be funded by another funder. Is that a case where we would consider stepping in to partially fund a project that has got secured funding from a conservation org?
Oh yes, so that would perfectly fit this program, basically, the small grants program. So if you got conservation funding for looking at the genetics or movement patterns of a wild animal, and then you wanted to apply for us for additional funding to look at their sort of stress hormones or something like that, yeah, that would be a very good proposal.
We're gonna stick around for a couple more minutes, see if there's any last questions. Luke, would you mind going back to the slide with the application timeline? Yeah, so there's a question about just the application process, and I just want to go back through the slide and clarify. So we're asking for expression of interest forms, which yes, they're very basic. They're not full proposals. They're basically pitching a project idea so that we can help you see if it's competitive before you invest time in a full proposal. So someone was asking, like, our registration form does not seem to be a full proposal process. That's correct. If your expression of interest is promising, we will then invite you to submit a full proposal. So that will be happening in July. So we'll give you like a separate application form then in July, and the deadline for submitting full proposals will be September 30th.
We don't have the full proposal form available to share yet for this round, but this slide shows basically what we're looking for.
What kind of budget restrictions would apply to these projects? What are some things that we might not consider funding?
Yeah, so this is written about in more detail in the sort of call for proposals announcement PDF on the webpage. But we're sort of open to funding anything except for university overhead. So universities might ask for a 10% cut just for administering the grant. And we generally say no to that. But we are open to funding, well, certainly to funding materials for the project, travel and salary. Salary and student stipends and things like that will need to be fairly well justified, especially given the small amounts involved in this small grants call. But if, for example, you have an unfunded studentship, then we would consider providing a stipend to enable you to focus on your studies on the project that we're funding. We would be less likely to provide salary support to someone who already has like a full professor salary or something like that. But it's definitely decided on a case-by-case basis, depending on what's necessary to make the project doable.
What about equipment that's durable, so it would last longer than the project that's proposed and could be used for things besides the proposed project?
Yeah, so that will need to be decided on a case-by-case basis, and it will depend on how how large a proportion of the budget it makes up. So, well, we've defined this range of about $2,000 to $30,000 that we're targeting with small grants call, but we also definitely value cost effectiveness. So a lab that was able to deliver the same project for $5,000 because they already had certain equipment versus asking us to invest in equipment that would bring the total cost up to $30,000 would be something we'd have to very strongly consider. That would depend on sort of other work being done in the lab, for example, like whether it was likely to contribute to other welfare projects or to help start a lab focusing on wild animal welfare. But this would definitely be considered on a case-by-case basis. So I think we'd get to that at the full proposal stage, but you can email at any time to ask about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Luke. I think that's a really good place to end. Looks like our questions have been mostly answered for the folks who are in attendance. As a reminder, most of your questions will be answered in the Call for Proposals PDF. You can find that on the webpage I linked in the chat above. I've also just reminded everyone of our email address for the grants program. Feel free to contact us at any time with questions that are specific to your project. We really want to make this proposal process as beneficial for everyone involved. We're invested in working with you to develop competitive proposals. So please feel free to contact us. We are happy to answer your questions. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Luke, for your presentation, your great answers. Thank you, Victoria and Simon, also for helping with answering questions. Yeah, and we hope to hear from you all soon in your expressions of interest.